How my father S will force me to destroy my family. My father S wasn't a gift, it was a weapon he aimed at his own corrupted legacy, and he left my finger on the trigger. So when the time came, I didn't feel triumph watching the family business burn, only the cold, methodical certainty of a promise being kept. Justice, I learned, is a far heavier burden than grief. The air in Mr. Davies' office was the temperature of old money, cool, still, and heavy with the scent of mahogany and decaying paper. Arthur Vance felt like an intruder, his work-worn hands resting awkwardly on the polished table, a stark contrast to the manicured fingers of his siblings. His brother, Leo, ever the CFO, radiated a confident grief, his tailored black suit a second skin. His sister, Sophia, head of the company SPR, had perfected a look of tragic elegance, a single, artful tear held in check. Between them sat their aunt, Clara, Richard Vance's younger sister, her face a mask of gentle sorrow that didn't quite reach her sharp, calculating eyes. Mr. Davies, a man who seemed dissembled from dust and legal precedent, adjusted his spectacles. He read through the minor bequests with a dry monotone, a timepiece to a cousin, a collection of maritime maps to an old friend. Leo subtly checked his watch. Sophia sighed with delicate impatience. They were waiting for the main event, the disposition of Vance Construction, the empire their father, Richard, had built from gravel and sheer will. And now, Davies said, his voice dropping slightly, we come to the primary assets of the estate, namely Vance Construction and its associated holdings. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. All shares, properties, and liquid assets are to be placed into a singular trust. The sole executor and primary beneficiary of this trust is to be Arthur Vance. The silence that followed was not one of reverence, but of a sudden, violent vacuum. Leo's polished smile didn't fall, it froze, a rictus of disbelief. Sophia's hand, which had been patting her aunt's, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. Executor? Leo's voice was dangerously smooth. Arthur. Dad's will makes Arthur the executor. And primary beneficiary, Davies affirmed, his gaze fixed on the document. However, the inheritance is conditional. It is subject to a codicil, Article 4, Section B. He cleared his throat again, a dry, rustling sound that set Arthur's teeth on edge. The beneficiary, Arthur Vance, is granted a period of 1 calendar year from this day to conduct a full and personal audit of all business operations. He is instructed, by his sole discretion, to identify and dissolve, by any and all legal means, any asset, contract, or ongoing concern found to be, and I quote, morally compromised or ethically unsound. Davies looked up over his glasses, his eyes sweeping across the stunned faces. Should this task not be completed to the executor's satisfaction within the stipulated 365 days, or should the executor refuse this duty, the entire Vance Trust will be immediately liquidated. The full proceeds, without exception, will be donated to the International Consortium for Governmental Accountability. He folded the paper with unnerving precision. In that event, the family will receive nothing. The room erupted. This is insanity. Leo shot to his feet, the chair scraping violently against the floorboards. It's a sick joke from a sick man. He was paranoid, delusional. Arthur, you can't possibly entertain this. Sophia turned on him, her voice a silken weapon. A test? This isn't a test, Leo, this is a demolition order. Father is asking Arthur to destroy his own legacy, our legacy, based on a paranoid fantasy. How could you let him write this? The accusation was aimed at Arthur, her eyes shimmering with a fury that masqueraded as pain. You were the only one he'd see at the end. Did you put these ideas in his head? It was Aunt Clara, however, who delivered the most potent poison. She rose slowly, placing a calming hand on Leo's arm. Children, please. Your father, he wasn't he himself. This isn't the man who built our family. This is the bitter whisper of his illness. She looked at Arthur, her expression a careful blend of pity and disappointment. Arthur, dear, you're an engineer. You build things. Your father is asking you to swing a wrecking ball based on a dying man's fears. We can fight this. We can honor his memory, not his madness. Arthur said nothing. He looked from his brother's contained rage to his sister's theatrical betrayal and his aunt's cloying sympathy. He saw no grief for a lost father. He saw three predators who had just watched their prize kill be handed to the one member of the pack who didn't hunt. The codicil wasn't a product of paranoia. It was a map, left behind by a man who knew his territory was filled with traps and his own blood had laid them. It was a final, desperate command. Davy slid a heavy, leather-bound ledger across the table. It stopped inches from Arthur's hands. Your father compiled these preliminary notes for you. He was quite meticulous. The old lawyer's face was impassive, a courier delivering a declaration of war. The clock, Mr. Vance, is now ticking. The Vance Construction headquarters felt like a foreign country. A vast, abstract painting, a chaotic slash of blues and grays that his father had despised but Sophia had insisted was a statement, dominated the marble lobby. Employees moved with a hushed reverence, their gazes sliding past Arthur as if he were a ghost haunting the gilt-edged frames of his own family's success. He had spent his career on windswept construction sites, his hands deep in the practical world of rebar and concrete. This place, with its climate-controlled air and silent, gliding elevators, was his brother's kingdom. Leo's office was on the top floor, a glass-walled cage overlooking the city. He greeted Arthur with a practiced, brotherly embrace that felt more like a frisk. Art, good to see you. Taking the throne, are we? He joked, gesturing to the expansive desk. Look, about the other day things were said. We were all in shock. Grief does strange things. I need the financials, Leo. Everything from the last 5 years, Arthur said, bypassing the offered olive branch. PL statements, balance sheets, cash flow, all major contracts and land acquisition files. Of course, of course. Full transparency. Leo beamed, his charisma a blinding force. He swiveled in his high-backed leather chair and tapped a few keys on his computer. I've had my team put everything together for you. It's a bit of a data dump, we just migrated to a new accounting platform, so some of the legacy files are temperamental. But it's all there. He slid a sleek, silver USB drive across the polished expanse of his desk. Knock yourself out. Back in his father's old office, a spacehead claimed as his base of operations, much to the silent disapproval of the staff, Arthur plugged the drive into his laptop. It was exactly as Leo described, and yet, it was nothing of the sort. The data was a labyrinth of corrupted files, password-protected spreadsheets with no provided passwords, and folders named with meaningless alphanumeric codes. The few documents that did open were raw data logs, thousands of lines of transactions stripped of all context. It was a perfect portrait of malicious compliance and avalanche of information that revealed absolutely nothing. He had been given a dictionary and asked to find a story. His phone buzzed. It was his cousin, Amelia. Her voice was tight with a carefully manufactured concern. Arthur. I just had the most peculiar call with Sophia. She's worried sick about you. She said you're under so much pressure from Dad's will that you're planning a fire sale of our assets to meet the deadline. Is everything all right? Arthur's knuckles whitened around his phone. Sophia wasn't managing the family's anxiety, she was directing it, painting him as a reckless amateur poised to liquidate their shared history out of greed or incompetence. He hung up and walked to her office, a vibrant, sunlit space filled with orchids and framed magazine covers featuring the company's philanthropic triumphs. She saw him and her face bloomed with relief. Arthur. I'm so glad you're here. I've been trying to run interference all morning. The cousins are in a panic. I told them you just need time, that you're being methodical. She wrung her hands, a perfect gesture of helplessness. I'm trying to protect you, but they see this outsider taking over and they're scared. We just need to present a united front. Her words were like silk wrapped around a razor. She was offering to solve a problem she had created, positioning herself as his indispensable shield while simultaneously isolating him. The final visit of the day came from Aunt Clara, who appeared at his office door with 2 cups of tea on a small tray, a vision of maternal comfort. "I thought you could use this," she said, her voice a soothing balm. She settled into the visitor's chair, her eyes scanning the sparse, undecorated office with a flicker of disapproval. "Arthur, this burden your father placed on you, it's unjust. You're a builder, not a demolition man. This world of hostile audits and corporate law is venomous." She took a delicate sip of her tea. "Leo is a brilliant CFO, and Sophia has a gift for navigating public perception. They can help you. Perhaps, if you were to delegate the audit to them, let them prove the company's integrity themselves, it would satisfy the spirit of your father's wishes. It would take this terrible weight from your shoulders and show the family you trust them." Arthur looked at his aunt, the gentle mediator, the family's soft heart. She was suggesting he hand the keys to the hen house back to the Foxes. They weren't just resisting him, they were coordinating. Leo was starving him of information, Sophia was poisoning the well of family support, and Clara was trying to disarm him with kindness, to convince him to surrender his authority willingly. They moved like a pack, their teeth hidden behind warm, familiar smiles. Stonewalled by the digital fortress Leo had built, Arthur retreated to a domain he understood: the physical world. He abandoned the sleek, sterile upper floors and descended into the building's basement, to the corporate archives. It was a space of cool, dry air and the faint, dusty scent of aging paper, a library of the company's history told in cardboard boxes and labeled manila folders. Here, numbers weren't just pixels on a screen, they were tied to blueprints, soil analysis reports, and property deeds, things with weight and substance. He bypassed contracts and payroll, the territories his brother so expertly controlled. Instead, he started pulling the files on land holdings, the very foundation of the Vance Empire. As a civil engineer, he knew how to read the land better than he could read a balance sheet. He spent 2 days immersed in a world of topographic maps, zoning regulations, and environmental impact statements, looking not for a cooked book, but for a fraud story. He searched for acquisitions that didn't make logistical sense or divestitures that seemed too convenient. On the 3rd day, he found it. The Northwood Tract. A 200-acre parcel on the city Essex urban fringe, acquired a decade ago. According to the file, Vance Construction had planned a major residential development, but pre-construction surveys revealed significant soil composition problems, unstable loam, poor drainage, making the project financially unviable. The final entry, dated 5 years ago, was a deed of donation. The company had gifted the unusable land to a non-profit called the Green Earth Alliance for a substantial tax write-off. A tidy, sensible business decision. But Arthur remembered the Northwood Tract. He had walked it with his father years ago, the old man's arm sweeping across the horizon as he spoke of future parks and communities. Richard Vance had a sixth sense for land, an instinct for its hidden potential. The idea that he would misjudge a parcel so badly felt wrong. The soil report in the folder was thin, a 2-page summary that read more like an excuse than a proper geotechnical survey. Working late into the night, Arthur went beyond the company's internal records, diving into the city's public online database. He cross-referenced the property's historical zoning records. A single, glaring fact emerged. 6 weeks after Vance Construction donated the land, the city council, citing a new municipal growth plan, rezoned the entire Northwood district for commercial use. The value of that unstable land would have skyrocketed overnight. His heart began a slow, heavy beat. He ran a search on the Green Earth Alliance. It was a legitimate charity, but its digital footprint was faint. Its mission statement was vague, its board of directors anonymous. It felt less like a cause and more like a curtain. The final piece fell into place when he accessed the county registrar's digital archives. He pulled the chain of title for the Northwood Tract. There was the first transfer Vance Construction to the Green Earth Alliance. The price $1. 3 months later, a second transfer appeared. The Green Earth Alliance sold the same 200 acres to a limited liability company, Apex Holdings. The price was, again, nominal. Then, 8 months after that, the final, devastating transaction. Apex Holdings sold the Northwood tract to a national retail developer for a sum that made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. The paperwork was flawless, a series of perfectly legal steps. But the logic was a confession. They hadn't donated the land, they had laundered it. They moved it off the company books to a shell charity to claim a tax benefit, passed it through another shell corporation to obscure its origins, and then cashed it out once the zoning change they clearly anticipated went through. The profit never touched Vance Construction's ledgers. Arthur leaned back, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows across the silent archive room. He navigated back to the initial donation document, the one that had started the whole charade. There were 2 signatures required for an asset disposal of that magnitude. The first was his father's, bold and familiar. The second, countersigning as the chief financial officer who certified the asset as a loss, was the clean, arrogant script of his brother, Leo. The signature haunted Arthur more than the crime itself. His father's hand, once a symbol of unwavering strength, was now an unwilling accomplice to a phantom deal. Was he a victim, his trust exploited in his declining years? Or was he, in some way, complicit? The question was a splinter in Arthur's mind, and he knew the answer wouldn't be found in the corporate archives or Leo's sterile office. It lay in the one place that was purely his father's sanctuary, the private study at the old family home. He drove there that evening, letting himself in with his own key. The house was a silent museum of their shared past. The study smelled of leather, pipe tobacco, and old paper, a sense so deeply ingrained it felt like a memory itself. Unlike the rest of the house, which had been updated and redecorated by Sophia over the years, this room was untouched, a time capsule of Richard Vance's mind. A wall of books on engineering and history, a large oak desk scarred with decades of work, a globe with faded coastlines in the corner. Arthur began a systematic search, not of a man hiding a secret, but of an engineer who built systems. He ran his hands along the custom-built bookshelves his father had designed himself, checking for any incongruity. His fingers traced the joinery, the precise fit of mahogany and brass. Near the bottom, behind a row of thick architectural tomes, his knuckles brushed against a seam that shouldn't have been there. Pressing gently, he felt a faint click. A section of the wood, no larger than a shoebox, swung inward, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside was not a document or a weapon, but a single, old-fashioned brass key, heavy and ornate, attached to a simple leather fob with a number etched into it, 317. There was no bank name, no other identifier. The next morning was a tedious exercise in patience. Arthur started with the banks closest to his father's office, then the ones near the house. At the third, a quiet, old-world establishment named Sterling Trust, the teller recognized the key's design. A short time later, Arthur was being led into the chilled, silent air of the vault. The clerk used her own key, then Arthur's. The heavy metal door of box 317 swung open. The box was nearly empty. There was no cash, no bearer bonds, no jewelry. There was only a single, thick, leather-bound accountant's ledger and a sealed envelope on top of it, with his name, Arthur, written in his father's distinctive, forceful script. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The note inside was brutally short. I know. All of it. Protect the name, not the people. A cold dread washed over him, a feeling far deeper than the vault's chill. He opened the ledger. It was his father's handwriting, neat and precise. The book was a shadow history of Vance Construction. Each left-hand page detailed a transaction exactly as it appeared on the official company records, likely copied from the reports Leo would have provided. But on the right-hand page, his father had conducted his own forensic analysis. There were arrows, calculations in the margins, and terse, coded notes. He saw entries for inflated invoices from shell suppliers, with his father's annotation kickback to see. Materials never delivered. He saw exorbitant consulting fees paid to phantom firms as entertainment fund. No report filed. Then he found it. A page dedicated to the Northwood Tract. On the left, the official story, the donation to the Green Earth Alliance for a tax write-off. On the right, his father's devastating counter-narrative. He had tracked the subsequent sales to Apex Holdings and then to the developer. He had calculated the true profit margin, the money that had simply vanished. And at the bottom of the page, a single, heartbreaking sentence, Leo's signature. Clara arranged the zoning. I was a fool to trust them. Arthur closed the ledger. The weight in his hands was no longer just paper and ink. It was the weight of his father's silent, lonely knowledge. His father hadn't been paranoid or delusional. He had been a king trapped in his own castle, watching his heirs dismantle his kingdom from the inside, brick by stolen brick. The bizarre codicil in the will was not an act of madness. It was a posthumous deputization, a carefully crafted tool placed in the hands of the one son he believed he could still trust. His father had already done the audit, he just needed Arthur to execute the sentence. The ledger was more than a record of theft, it was a ghost story, and one name echoed through its pages with the frequency of a tolling bell: Marcus Thorne. Thorne had been his father's first partner, the co-architect of the company's foundational years. Arthur remembered him as a gruff, brilliant project manager who could solve complex structural problems with a pencil and a napkin. Then, about 8 years ago, he was simply gone. The official story, managed expertly by Sophia, was of a bitter falling out over creative differences, followed by Thorne's quiet retirement. But in the ledger, next to entries detailing a massive cost overrun on a bridge project, his father had written and took the fall. For whom? The numbers don't lie, but Leo's report does. Finding Thorne wasn't difficult. A man like that doesn't disappear, he just finds a new place to build. Arthur found him in a small town 2 hours north of the city, running a bespoke cabinetry workshop out of his garage. The house was modest but impeccably maintained, the lawn cut with geometric precision. When Thorne answered the door, he looked like a man who had been weathered by a long, internal storm. His face was leaner, his hair grayer, but his eyes were the same, sharp, analytical, and instantly wary. Vance, he said, his voice gravelly. It wasn't a question. To what do I owe the displeasure? I need to talk to you about my father, Arthur said, holding his ground against the palpable hostility. And about the company. Thorne's laugh was a dry, mirthless rasp. The company. Right. Your father's dead, and you're here. Let me guess. You're the new king, and you're tying up loose ends. He started to close the door. He left me a book, Arthur said quickly, his hand moving to the briefcase he carried. A private ledger. Your name is in it. The door stopped. Thorne's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something other than bitterness in their depths. Show me. Inside, the house smelled of sawdust and lemon oil. Thorne led him not to a living room, but to the workshop, a space of order and tangible creation. On a large drafting table, under the glare of an architect's lamp, Arthur opened his father's ledger to the page on the bridge project. He said nothing, simply pointing to his father's spidery annotation. Thorne leaned over the book, his rough craftsman's fingers tracing the words without touching the page. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the hum of a ventilation fan. When he finally looked up, the hard shell of his anger had cracked, revealing a deep, ancient hurt. He knew, Thorne whispered, more to himself than to Arthur. The old man knew. He suspected, Arthur corrected gently. He didn't have proof. I think he spent his last years trying to find it. Thorne sank onto a stool, the energy seeming to drain from him. It wasn't a cost overrun, he said, his voice low. It was a siphon. Leo set up a shell company for specialty steel procurement. He'd build a project for high-grade German steel, deliver cheap, substandard materials, and pocket the difference. It was my job to sign off on material certifications. When I refused, he threatened to expose a minor regulatory shortcut ID taken years earlier, something your father knew about and had approved to save a different project. He looked at Arthur, his eyes clear with the memory of injustice. But that wasn't enough. They needed a scapegoat for the missing money. Your Aunt Clara was on the board's audit committee. She buried Leo's fake invoices and manufactured a report that laid the entire financial discrepancy at my feet. Negligence, they called it. Gross mismanagement. He shook his head slowly. Your father was forced to choose between his partner and his son. He chose blood. I was given a severance package on the condition I sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear. That was their first big score, Arthur realized aloud. The template for everything that came after. And they've been perfecting it ever since, I imagine, Thorne said. He stood up and walked to a heavy, fireproof filing cabinet in a corner of the workshop. He spun the combination lock and pulled open a drawer. From the very back, he withdrew a thick, dust-covered binder. I may have signed an NDA, he said, placing the binder on the table next to Richard Van Cess' ledger, but I'm not a fool. I knew what they were capable of. This is my insurance policy. He opened it. Inside were copies of the original, fraudulent invoices from Leo's shell company, a sworn affidavit detailing the entire scheme that had notarized at the time, and a printout of an email from Clara instructing the accounting department to block his access to the project's financials. They ruined my name, Thorne said, his voice now cold and hard as the steel they were meant to have bought. They turned your father against me and stole a piece of the company I helped build. If you're here to burn them to the ground, Arthur, then you can have it all. My testimony, my documents, everything. It's time someone held them accountable. Arthur chose his moment with the precision of an engineer planning a critical load test. He waited until the end of the day, when the building was emptying out and the sky outside Leo's glass-walled office was streaked with the bruised purples of twilight. He didn't call ahead. He simply walked in, holding a single sheet of paper. Leo was on the phone, his feet up on his vast desk, laughing at something the person on the other end had said. He waved Arthur in with a casual, magnanimous gesture, finishing his call with a flourish. Art. To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to finally take my offer and delegate this whole audit mess. I have a question about the Kerwood Bridge project, Arthur said, his voice level. He placed the photocopy on the desk. It was one of the invoices from Thorne's binder, detailing the purchase of high-grade German structural steel from a supplier named Apex Materials. Leo glanced at it, his smile not faltering in the slightest. Kerwood? God, that's ancient history. What about it? Apex Materials, Arthur said. I can't find any record of them. They don't exist. They weren't a steel supplier, they were a post office box in a strip mall. The materials delivered to that site were substandard, and the cost difference was about $4 million. The smile finally tightened at the edges. Leo swung his feet off the desk and leaned forward, picking up the paper. He feigned a look of confused concentration. This is Thorne's era. The man was a sloppy bookkeeper. This is probably just some vendor misclassification. You're an engineer, Arthur, you can't possibly understand the complexities of international procurement finance. I understand the properties of steel, Arthur countered, his voice like ice. And I understand that you signed the payment authorization. The money went from Vance Construction to a ghost company, and the bridge's integrity was compromised. That's not finance, Leo. That's fraud. For a moment, the mask of the charming CFO dissolved completely. Arthur saw a flash of cold, reptilian fury in his brother's eyes before it was expertly suppressed. Leo leaned back, tenting his fingers. The bonhomie was gone, replaced by a chillingly pragmatic calm. All right, he said softly, as if speaking to a child. Okay. So you found an old discrepancy. A mistake. Something that Dad and I handled years ago. What do you want, Arthur? A medal for your due diligence. I want to understand the scope of the moral compromise in this company, Arthur said, quoting the will's precise language. Leo let out a short, sharp laugh. He stood up and walked to the wet bar in the corner of the office, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. He offered one to Arthur, who ignored it. Moral compromise, Leo mused, swirling the amber liquid. Dad and his theatrics. Look. You've made your point. You're a clever boy. You dug up some dirt. He took a long sip. So let's stop this charade. This will is nonsense, and we both know it. It's the rambling of a sick old man. You and I, we're what's left. Let's be practical. Forget the 1-year deadline, forget dissolving assets. We present a clean audit, my team can generate one in a week, and we split the company. It'll even sweeten the pot. 60-40. Your favor. For being the executor. It was the offer of a stranger trying to close a hostile takeover, not a brother. The casual dismissal of their father, the easy willingness to commit further fraud, the reduction of their entire legacy to a percentage point, it was all laid bare. It's not for sale, Leo, Arthur said quietly. Everything is for sale, Art, Leo snapped, his voice losing its silken edge. He put the glass down with a heavy thud. Don't be a saint. It doesn't suit you. You've spent your life in the mud on job sites while I built this into a financial powerhouse. Don't think you can just walk in here with one piece of paper and play judge and jury. The will is clear, Arthur said, turning to leave. I'm following my instructions. He had his hand on the doorknob when Leo's voice, now stripped of all warmth, stopped him. You know, construction is a dangerous business, Leo said, his tone conversational again, but with a new, menacing undercurrent. So many moving parts. Unfortunate accidents happen all the time. A man could get hurt digging around in places he doesn't belong. It would be a tragedy to lose the company's new executor so soon. Arthur paused, but he didn't turn around. He had his answer. The brother he thought he knew, the affable, charming man who was a fixture at family gatherings, did not exist. In his place was this cold, ruthless creature who would bribe, steal, and threaten to protect his stolen kingdom. He had come here with proof of a crime, and he was leaving with the confirmation of something much worse, the absolute absence of a soul. Leo's threat echoed in Arthur's mind, not as a source of fear, but as a clarifying signal. It was the frantic roar of a cornered animal, but it felt secondary. A piece was still missing from the puzzle. The schemes were too elaborate for Leo's straightforward greed and too subtle for Sophia's self-centered manipulations. There was an architect behind the enforcers, a mind providing the blueprints for their corruption. He returned to Marcus Thorne's workshop, the 2 ledgers, his father's and Thorne's, laid open on the drafting table like ancient, opposing texts. Thorne, a man rejuvenated by a purpose he thought long dead, was cross-referencing payment dates and project codes with a methodical intensity. It's the destinations, Thorne said, tapping a page with a calloused finger. The money leaves Vance Construction, goes to Apex Materials or Green Earth Alliance, then it moves again. But where does it land? A shell company can't just sit on millions in profit. That draws attention. It has to be spent, invested, or laundered further. This was Thorne's territory. While Arthur could see the structural flaws in a deal, Thorne understood the flow of money, the currents that pulled it into hidden harbors. For 2 days, they dug into the public records of Apex Holdings, the LLC that had profited from the Northwood Tract. It had been dissolved a year after the big sale, but its final tax filings were a matter of public record, buried deep in state commerce databases. They found what they were looking for in a schedule of disbursements, a series of massive investment payments to a single entity. Claremont Ventures. Never heard of them, Arthur said, running a corporate search. Neither have I, Thorne muttered, leaning over his shoulder. Probably another shell. The search results loaded onto the screen. Claremont Ventures was a holding company for a portfolio of boutique businesses, a struggling art gallery downtown, a high-end interior design firm that had never landed a major client, and a recently defunct luxury travel agency. They were all classic vanity projects, bleeding money. But it was the name listed as the sole registered agent and owner that made the air in the workshop turn to ice. Clara Vance. Arthur stared at the screen, his mind struggling to connect the name to the crime. Aunt Clara, the gentle peacemaker, the family's warm, steady center. The woman who brought him tea and urged him to trust his siblings. It was impossible. No, Arthur said, shaking his head. She wouldn't know how. Wouldn't she? Thorne's voice was grim. He walked over to his filing cabinet and pulled a different, thinner file. Your father and I had one major, recurring argument in the early days. It was always about Clara. She was constantly pushing him to diversify, to invest in what she called projects with cultural cachet. Art, fashion, bespoke travel. Richard always refused. He called them black holes for cash. He said she had champagne taste and a gambler's discipline. Thorne laid an old newspaper clipping on the table. It was from the society pages, 20 years old, showing a young, beaming Clara at the grand opening of her first art gallery. The one that had failed within a year. The pieces began to fall into a new, sickening alignment. The Northwood Tract, Clara had been the one with connections on the city council, the one who served on charity boards with the council members' spouses. She would have had the advanced knowledge of the rezoning. The bridge project, she sat on the audit committee that buried Leo's fraud and crucified Thorne. She had provided the institutional cover. Leo wasn't the mastermind. He was the bank. Sophia wasn't a strategist. She was the mouthpiece. They were willing, greedy accomplices, but their aunt had been pulling their strings for years, playing on their specific weaknesses. She stoked Leo's ambition and greed, giving him the tools to steal and assuring him he was smart enough to get away with it. She fed Sophia's desperate need for social status, using the company's philanthropy, the fraudulent donation of the Northwood land, to elevate her niece's public profile. It was her operation. Vance Construction wasn't just being robbed to enrich her children, it was being bled to secretly finance the business empire her brother had always denied her, and to settle a lifelong score against the man she felt had overshadowed her. Her gentle interventions, her concerned phone calls, her attempts to mediate, they were all the actions of a criminal mastermind checking on her assets, managing her co-conspirators, and trying to neutralize the one threat she hadn't anticipated: a son who was actually honest. Arthur thought of her in his father's office, her face a mask of sorrow, urging him to abandon the will. This isn't the man who built our family. She was right. The man who built the family would never have stood for this. And the woman who was trying to tear it down had been hiding in plain sight, smiling, all along. The discovery of Clara's role changed the nature of the war. This was no longer just a violation of a will or a simple case of embezzlement. It was a long-running, organized criminal enterprise operating under the cover of a legitimate business. Leo's threats, Sophia's manipulations, the shell companies, the kickbacks, the laundering of the Northwood Tract, they were all interconnected acts in a conspiracy. A probate court challenge or a civil suit would be a pea shooter against a fortress. Arthur needed a cannon. He knew he couldn't use Mr. Davies, the family estate lawyer. The man was a creature of wills and trusts, not criminal indictments. There was only one person his father would have trusted with this level of devastation: Julian Croft. Croft had been Richard Vance's personal counsel for 40 years, the architect of his first contracts and his staunchest defender in boardroom battles. He had retired 5 years ago, but the name still carried the weight of a legend in the city's legal circles. He was known for his sharp mind and a moral compass that was as unbending as a steel I-beam. Arthur found him not in a high-rise office but in a quiet university library, where he spent his days as a guest lecturer in legal ethics. Croft was thinner than Arthur remembered, his hair white, but his eyes, behind a pair of simple reading glasses, were as piercing as ever. He listened without interruption as Arthur laid out the entire story, from the reading of the will to the discovery of Claremont Ventures. Arthur presented the evidence methodically: his father's ledger, Thorne's binder of documents, and the printouts of the corporate filings that tied everything to Clara. When Arthur finished, Croft removed his glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief. He didn't seem shocked or surprised, merely grave, as if he were a doctor examining a terminal diagnosis he had long suspected. "Your father called me about a month before he passed," Croft said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "He didn't give me details. He just said the rot was in the roots. He asked me, hypothetically, what it would take to purify a company that had been poisoned from the inside." Croft's gaze met Arthur's. "I told him it would require fire. Not a lawsuit. A prosecution." He slid the documents back across the table. "This is more than enough to act. What they've done, this is a pattern of criminal activity. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion. If we can prove they coordinated these acts over a period of years for financial gain, then we are in the territory of the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. We won't be suing your family, Arthur. We will be providing the U.S. Attorney's Office with a turnkey case to dismantle a criminal enterprise." For the next 2 weeks, they worked with the methodical precision of demolition experts planning an implosion. They operated not from an office but from a secure room in the back of the university library. Julian Croft, energized by a final, righteous battle, quarterbacked the effort, while Arthur, using his engineer's mind for systems and details, organized the evidence. Marcus Thorne served as their star witness, preparing a detailed, chronological sworn statement that connected the dots from the first act of fraud to the present. They built a fortress of paper. Every transaction was mapped, every shell company's lifespan documented, every fraudulent invoice cross-referenced with bank transfer records that Croft's legal authority allowed them to subpoena. They created a timeline that showed how Clara's personal business failures perfectly coincided with major cash extractions from Vance Construction. They even pulled Sophia's expense reports, showing how her charity galas and PR events were used as networking opportunities to influence the very politicians who later approved the Northwood rezoning. It was a cold, dispassionate process. Arthur felt a strange detachment as he assembled the case that would destroy his family. He wasn't acting out of rage or a desire for revenge. He was simply following the evidence to its logical conclusion, fulfilling the final, terrible instruction of his father. He was protecting the name, the legacy of integrity Richard Vance had tried to build, by surgically removing the people who carried it. When the file was complete, it was over 500 pages long, a meticulous and undeniable indictment. Croft placed the final document on the stack and looked at Arthur. "Once I make the call and this is delivered, there is no going back," the old lawyer said, his voice devoid of any drama. "Their lives, as they know them, will end." "Are you certain?" Arthur thought of his father's note. "I know. Protect the name, not the people." He thought of Leo's threat, Sophia's lies, and Clara's poisoned kindness. He nodded. "I am." The call came from Clara. Her voice was a warm, honeyed confection of concern. "Arthur, darling. We need to talk. All of us, together. As a family. Please, come to the house for dinner tonight. Just the 4 of us." It wasn't a request, it was a summons disguised as an olive branch. Arthur knew precisely what it was, the final move in their campaign. His silence had unnerved them. His methodical work in the archives, his trips out of town, they knew something was shifting, and her instinct was to draw the circle close, to reassert control. He arrived at the family home at 7. The table in the formal dining room was set with the good china, the silver polished to a painful gleam. Leo stood by the fireplace, nursing a drink, looking every bit the burdened executive. Sophia was arranging flowers in a vase, a study in fragile beauty. And Clara presided over it all, her smile radiating a gentle, maternal authority. It was a perfectly staged tableau of a loving family worried for its troubled son. They made it through the soup with strained small talk before Clara laid her napkin down and fixed Arthur with a look of profound, sorrowful pity. "Arthur," she began, her voice soft as velvet. "We are so worried about you. This impossible task your father has given you, it's consuming you. You look exhausted. You're not sleeping." "He's shutting us out," Sophia chimed in, her lower lip trembling just so. "We try to help, we offer our support, and he treats us like strangers. Like enemies. It's as if he's forgotten we're his family." Leo took the lead, his tone one of weary reason. "Look, Art. It's gone on long enough. You're pursuing this witch hunt based on the paranoid ramblings of a dying man. You're not qualified to run an audit of this complexity. You're going to run the company into the ground, destroy Dad's legacy, trying to chase shadows. It's time to be realistic. It's time for us to step in." Clara placed her hand over Arthur's. It felt as cold as marble. "What we are proposing, dear, is for the good of everyone. For your own health. We have spoken to lawyers. We can petition the court to have an independent administrator appointed to oversee the will's execution. Someone who can see clearly that your father was not in his right mind. It would free you from this awful burden." There it was. The checkmate. They were going to have him declared incompetent, a grief-stricken, paranoid amateur incapable of executing his duties. They would seize control of the trust and bury their crimes forever. Arthur slowly withdrew his hand from under his hands. He said nothing. He simply reached down to the briefcase at his feet, retrieved a thin file folder, and placed it in the center of the table. He opened it and slid the first page across the polished wood toward Leo. It was the invoice from Apex Materials. "A shadow," Arthur said quietly. He slid out the second page, pushing it toward Sophia. It was a copy of the deed transfer for the Northwood tract to the Green Earth Alliance, the charity that had sponsored her biggest philanthropic gala. A paranoid rambling. Finally, he took out the last document and placed it directly in front of Clara. It was the certificate of ownership for Claremont Ventures, her name printed in stark, undeniable black ink. "Your own health." The silence that followed was absolute. Leo's face, which had been a mask of concerned reason, turned a blotchy, furious red. Sophia stared at the deed as if it were a venomous snake, her composure shattering into jagged pieces of disbelief. Clara's mask didn't fall, it seemed to calcify, her gentle features hardening into something brittle and dangerous. "What is this?" Clara's voice was a venomous whisper. "What have you been doing?" "My duty," Arthur said. "I've been conducting the audit." "You have no right." Leo snarled, half rising from his chair. "Spying, stealing documents." He was cut off by the sharp, authoritative ring of the doorbell. Once, then twice. The sound sliced through the suffocating tension in the room. They all froze. A moment later, the housekeeper appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Man, there are some people at the door. They say they're federal investigators. They have a warrant." Clara's teacup, halfway to her lips, slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. The sound was like a gunshot. Leo sank back into his chair, the color draining from his face. Sophia let out a small, choked sob. Two men and a woman, dressed in plain, conservative suits, stepped into the dining room. They moved with an unhurried, implacable calm. The lead agent, a woman with tired but intelligent eyes, held up her identification. Her gaze swept over the table, taking in the scattered documents, the shattered teacup, and the three frozen faces of Arthur's family. Clara Vance. Leo Vance. Sophia Vance. She asked, her voice professional and devoid of emotion. "We have a warrant to search these premises in connection with an ongoing investigation into wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. We need you to come with us." The great, invisible architecture of their power, the family name they had used as both a sword and a shield, dissolved in that instant. It was replaced by the cold, inescapable mechanics of the law. As they were led away, Clara shot Arthur a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, the final, true expression of the woman who had hidden behind a lifetime of gentle smiles. Arthur did not react. He simply sat at the head of the table in the silent, empty room, a king presiding over the ruins of his own kingdom. The implosion was swift and absolute. News of the arrest spread through the city's financial and social circles like a shockwave, leaving a crater where the Vance name had once stood as a monument to success. The media narrative, once so carefully curated by Sophia, was now a feeding frenzy of scandal. Headlines screamed of a dynasty of deceit, and photos of Leo in handcuffs and a weeping Sophia being led from the family home were plastered across every news site. The Vance name, once synonymous with integrity and quality, was now irrevocably linked to fraud and disgrace. Within 48 hours, federal marshals arrived at the Vance construction headquarters. They moved with a quiet, bureaucratic efficiency, changing the locks and placing official seals on the doors. A court-appointed receiver was put in charge. All assets were frozen, all accounts locked, and all operations suspended pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The engine of the empire his father had built from nothing sputtered and went silent. Arthur watched it all from a distance, a ghost at the funeral of his own legacy. He wasn't permitted inside the building. He was now just another witness in a federal case. He saw employees, people who had worked for his father for decades, carrying their personal belongings out in cardboard boxes, their faces a mixture of confusion, anger, and betrayal. They looked at him not with gratitude for exposing a wrong, but with the resentment reserved for the man who had brought their world crashing down. To them, he was not a savior, he was the executioner. Days bled into weeks. The initial charges were followed by a sweeping RICO indictment that laid out the decade-long conspiracy in damning detail. Marcus Thorne's testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, a first-hand account of the rot that had set in years ago. The evidence Arthur and Croft had compiled was so thorough, so irrefutable, that the defense lawyers had little to work with beyond procedural delays. Bail was denied for Clara and Leo, who were deemed flight risks. Sophia, considered a lesser player, was released on a multi-million-dollar bond secured against assets the government hadn't yet seized. One evening, long after the last of the federal agents and receivers had gone home, Arthur found himself drawn back to the corporate headquarters. He walked the perimeter of the silent, darkened skyscraper, a glass and steel mausoleum. The vibrant, chaotic slash of the abstract painting in the lobby was just a gray shadow behind the locked doors. The place felt hollow, an empty shell that had once housed so much life and ambition. He stood on the opposite side of the street, looking up at the top floor, at the dark, empty space that had been Leo's office. He remembered their final conversation, the easy offer of a bribe followed by the chilling threat. He thought of Sophia's curated grief and Clara's poisoned tea. He had not destroyed a family. He had exposed a lie. The family he thought he knew had been a carefully constructed facade, and the business a hollowed-out vessel for their greed. His father's directive had been to dissolve the morally compromised assets. He had succeeded beyond what Richard Vance could have ever imagined. He hadn't just dissolved a few bad contracts or shell companies, he had triggered the dissolution of the entire corrupt structure. He had fulfilled the letter of the will by surgically excising the cancer, but the surgery had killed the patient. There was no sense of victory. There was no righteous triumph. There was only the profound, aching silence of the aftermath. He had won the war his father had tasked him with fighting, but his reward was to stand alone on the empty battlefield, the sole heir to an empire of ash and a disgraced name. The house his father had built was gone, and in its place was a monument to the silence that follows a necessary, devastating truth. The courtroom was an antiseptic space, all pale wood and muted light, designed to strip emotion from human catastrophe. Arthur sat in the front row, a solitary island in a sea of dark suits. Across the aisle, the remnants of his extended family were clustered together, cousins, uncles, old family friends, a silent, unified wall of condemnation. Their backs were turned to him. They had not spoken a word to him in the 6 months since the arrests. On the defendant's side, his family sat as strangers. Leo's tailored confidence had collapsed into a haggard, sallow resignation. Sophia looked like a ghost, her beauty erased by months of public shame and private terror. And Clara, the matriarch, the architect of it all, was simply a small, withered old woman in a prison jumpsuit, the venom in her eyes replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. They never looked at him. To them, he was not family, he was the cataclysm that had ended their world. The verdicts were a formality. The evidence was a mountain, and their defense had been a shovel against an avalanche. Guilty. On all counts. The judge's words were crisp, precise, and utterly devastating. The sentences were long. As they were led away, their gazes remained fixed forward, refusing to grant him even the acknowledgement of their hatred. The gavel fell, and it was over. Justice, cold and clean and brutal, had been delivered. In the months that followed, Arthur worked with the court-appointed receiver and Julian Croft to execute the final, practical phase of his father's will. It was a painstaking process, an autopsy of a corporate giant. Arthur moved through the frozen assets not like a victor claiming spoils, but like an engineer assessing a collapsed structure, looking for the sound beams and untainted foundations that could be salvaged from the wreckage. Much of the company was unsalvageable, poisoned by its use as a slush fund for Clara's schemes. The shell corporations were dissolved. The fraudulent contracts were voided. The luxury assets bought with stolen money were seized and liquidated by the government to pay restitution and fines. But beneath the layers of rot, Arthur found the core of what his father had originally built: a portfolio of solid, honestly managed commercial properties, a small but efficient equipment leasing division, and a handful of long-term public works contracts that were clean. These were the assets he isolated and protected, the morally sound parts of the legacy. The final inheritance, after the government took its share and all debts were settled, was a fraction of the empire's former worth, but it was clean. It was a sum earned through honest work, not criminal genius. It was enough. He did not keep a penny for himself. Working with Croft, he established the Vance Foundation. It wasn't a glamorous charity for galas and photo opportunities. Its mission was brutally practical, a reflection of Richard Vance's true values. It provided scholarships for vocational schools, funded apprenticeships for young tradespeople, and offered grants for innovations in sustainable building materials and ethical civil engineering. Its first act was to fully fund a pension for all the Vance construction employees who had lost their jobs in the collapse. Its second was to quietly make Marcus Thorne whole, restoring the fortune and reputation that had been stolen from him. The estrangement from his family was total. He received a single letter, a week after the sentencing, from a cousin. It was filled with vitriol, accusing him of being a self-righteous monster who had chosen a dead man's vengeful fantasy over his living family. He had, the cousin wrote, burned down the entire forest to kill a single snake. Arthur read it, folded it, and put it away. There was no argument to be made. In their story, he would forever be the villain. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year to the day after the reading of the will, Arthur stood on a muddy plot of land on the city's edge. It was the first project of the Vance Foundation, a new community center and trade school. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel. He watched as a young crew, some of them former Vance employees he had rehired, guided a steel beam into place, their shouted commands of familiar, comforting music. He was a builder again. He had fulfilled his father's last command. He had protected the name by scouring it clean of the people who bore it. The justice was absolute, the moral victory undeniable. But as he stood there, alone, watching a new, honest structure rise from the ground, he felt the immense, echoing silence of all he had lost. The victory was not a warm, triumphant fire, it was a cold, clear light, illuminating a life now devoid of the brother, the sister, and the family he once thought he knew. It was the price of a clean name, paid in full. In the end, we see that the will wasn't just a weapon, but a terrible burden passed from a father to his son. Arthur kept his promise, but the trigger he was forced to pull left an echo that will last a lifetime. Justice, as he learned, isn't always a triumphant fire, sometimes it's just a cold, clean light that shows you how truly alone you are. We hope Arthur's difficult journey gave you something to think about, and we are so grateful to have you here at the Content Channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on a pivotal moment when Arthur discovered his Aunt Clara was the mastermind. Do you believe he had a moral obligation to confront her privately one last time, or was his decision to proceed directly with the law the only responsible choice he had left? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Join us next time as we explore what happens when the one family member who gets a second chance decides to rebuild a legacy on a foundation of lies.